thank you so much for joining us today. And this event would not have taken place without the collaborative spirit of Dr. Louise Huang. She is the director of the CRIS, the Center for Research and Science, based out of CLASS, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And we love when we are on campus because her office is down the hall, and often we see each other in passing and we flag each other down, say hello, or have on-the-fly conversations of our collaboration. And so this is one of her wonderful brainstorms that has now become a reality, to have Dr. Sethupathy with us. And so I'm going to now turn over this Ambassador Masterclass to Dr. Huang, who will be introducing the doctor for us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I'm so delighted to be with you this afternoon, and thank you for coming. I want to just give a little context how I met Praveen. So I've actually crossed paths with him without him knowing a few times. There were some collaborative projects that we were both involved in, a nonprofit called BioLogos. And I finally met him, I think, during COVID in a similar setting like this, a conference that Dr. Elaine Howard-Eklund put together. And I was just so intrigued because so many people told me I have to get to know him. And I finally did, and I asked a question, and I think I hunted him down on email, and he was so kind to write me back. And we share quite a few things in common. First and foremost, we both share the same alma mater, and then we both study science, and we're both Christians. So I thought, wow, what are the odds? And the more I talked to him, the more I was just so impressed and blessed by the way he sees science and faith, which to many are at odds. And I thought I have to invite him to campus. And because of the lockdown, this and that, it didn't happen for a long time. And finally, we got to kind of dream again. And I proposed that he would come in January to speak as a keynote speaker for our Science and Signature Science and Faith event. And he has this great topic, what is human? And we had a wonderful time last night exploring that in light of Imago Day. But I think I want to also really highlight some of his accolades and achievements. So Dr. Praveen Sethupathy is currently an associate professor of biomedical sciences and director of the Center for Vertebrate Genomics at Cornell University. He got his BA from Cornell University and his PhD in genomics from the University of Pennsylvania. He did his postdoc with former NIH director, Dr. Francis Collins. And in 2011, he was selected by Genome Technology as one of the nation's top 25 rising young investigators in genomics. Dr. Sethupathy has been named the American Diabetes Association Pathway to Stop Diabetes Research Accelerator. And this award is only given to 3 people per year. He is extremely productive. He has authored over 110 peer-reviewed journals and served as reviewer for over 40 different journals. And in addition, he is outstanding in teaching and mentoring because he received a Faculty Merit Award at Cornell University. Like I mentioned earlier, because science and faith are at odds, Dr. Sethupathy is really passionate and gifted in bridging the two and bringing harmony. He has spoken at Veritas Forum, BioLogos events, and we are just so honored to learn from him today. So I want to turn the mic over to Dr. Sethupathy.
Thank you, Dr. Huang. And I'll just say just a couple things, Doctor, is that as you have questions for the masterclass ambassadors, you can post them in the chat, and Mika will monitor that, those questions. And also, this is being recorded, so if you have colleagues that missed this event, it will be recorded as well. So, Dr. Sethupathy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez, Dr. Huang. Very kind introduction again. I really appreciate it. I'm grateful to be hosted by APU for all of the events I've been participating in this week. And it's my sincere hope that whoever has been listening has been able to get something out of it, something stimulating, something thought provoking. I have the same hope for today's conversation. I approach this conversation with a really healthy dose of humility. I think topics relating to DEI in our personal and professional lives, it's hard to identify something more important than that, particularly with what we're going through as a nation in race relations and in thinking about some of the kind of systemic biases that are present. And I really believe that Christians ought to be at the forefront of thinking about these issues, talking about them, wrestling with them together, and building community. I am certain that I can learn as much or more from each of you than you hopefully might from me today. So I see this more as a conversation, an opportunity to share a little bit about who I am and some of my reflections on DEI as a leader on the campus here at Cornell. And then hopefully leave most of the time to hear your experiences, questions, and thoughts, because I know I'll greatly benefit from that. So Dr. Martinez asked me if I might consider opening with just a brief testimony, and I'm really pleased and happy to do that, share just a little bit. Hopefully that gives you a window into who I am as a Christian and sort of how I got here. And then I'll transition into sharing, as I just mentioned, a few reflections that I have as not only an educator and a lab director, as well as a center director here on campus. How have I been wrestling with DEI? What are some of the kind of salient issues that have come up, and how have we tried to work those out? So I grew up in an Indian family here in America and Western New York for most of my life, but I was actually born in Canada. First few years of my life were in either Canada or Western New York, but I don't remember much about that because when I was 4, my mother actually passed away in a car accident. And my father at the time, who had only recently emigrated to the West, was thrown for a loop and had to figure out what was in store for him and for his family. And we went back to India for a short period of time. Ultimately, he decided to come back. He had a lot of professional aspirations. He immigrated to Hamilton, Ontario first, actually, in the late 70s, and that's where I was born. And he was a professor there at McMaster University. But my earliest memories are actually of growing up in India when I was 4 and 5 years old, because I actually don't remember much prior to that, as you might imagine. So when we finally moved back to the States when I was in about second grade or so, I was, a little chubby brown boy with a thick Indian accent. I mean, that's kind of how I remember myself and thought of myself back then. Um, and felt really out of place. I mean, when I was, even as a kindergartner and first grader in India, I didn't quite fit in. People knew that I was an American kid for the first few years of my life. And then when I came back here, I didn't quite fit in here either. And it's not as though I knew anything about my American experience. I had sort of thought of myself as Indian, and so it was a little confusing, and I felt out of place. And I think we all want a sense of belonging, which clearly connects to this notion of DEI. And I kind of silently and vociferously fought for that belonging at various stages of my upbringing. There's a separate story I could tell you, but I'll spare you for the moment, about how Buffalo Bills football actually helped me to feel American for probably the first time in my life. And it still remains something that I have a really strong emotional connection to, which is part of the reason why I'm depressed this week, for those of you that are following the NFL. But the point really here is that it was, I think, an interesting upbringing in that inside of my home, things were very Indian, very Hindu. And we actually come from the Brahmin caste, and so the expression of our faith was very robust. We were quite orthodox in our practice of Hindu traditions and rituals. And so I grew up with that. They were part and parcel of my upbringing. Um, and so the notion of God, the notion of worshiping a God, the notion that there was a maker and a creator, these weren't foreign concepts to me. I grew up with those ideas. Um, One important point to mention, though, is that God wasn't personal to me. Um, in other words, Hinduism didn't impart to me, at least in my experience, people can differ on this, given how diverse the Hindu faith is, a sense of a really deeply, profoundly personal God. And yet somehow I had that as a kid. And I'm not sure exactly where that came from, or if it was just the Holy Spirit working in me at a young age, even when I didn't know Him. Um, but I always had this sense that God was very personal, very accessible, very real, and everything but tangible, you know. And so um, I grew up that way, but never really kind of thought deeply about religion and what it meant to be or how it helped me think about who I was as a person, right? It was mostly just something I did, something that was a part of the culture in which I was growing up and that my father was trying to preserve for me, right? I mean, immigrant families, and this is true across the board for every, you immigrant family I've spoken to, they hold on to traditions of their home country and perhaps of their native faith even more tightly than people in those countries are at that moment in time, right? Because you're working really hard in a foreign land to preserve important aspects of who you are. So anyway, just trying to paint a picture that religion was very important to me, but I didn't think about it super deeply. I got to college, and college can be a very introspective time with your colleagues asking you hard questions, right? Um, and on the first day of college, my roommate asked me, well, what I believed. Um, he himself, he said, was an atheist, and he was curious about where I stood, and I told him I was a Hindu. Um, and he had a follow-up question, which was, well, what does that mean? And I was sort of embarrassed that I couldn't give him a cogent response. I kind of fumbled around a little bit and used some sort of classic words to describe Hinduism, but was deeply embarrassed at how impoverished my explanation was, and very aware of how little I understood about how much it shaped who I was. So I decided to embark on a journey to study the Hindu scriptures. One of the nice advantages of being at Cornell with so many course offerings and a plethora of experts on campus in a wide variety of different areas, even though I was a computer science major and a biology minor, I decided to set up a kind of comparative religion course for myself as my electives. So I ended up taking courses in Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam. Um, and as I studied the respective scriptures, I had the opportunity to meet with Buddhist priests and Hindu priests and imams on campus to kind of work out my questions. And it was really a wonderful time. And it was very academically enriching for me. And that's really all that it was, in the beginning. I was very curious about how these faith traditions compared. I was cognizant of the fact that they all were making various truth claims. And I was very interested in trying to determine whether all of those truth claims could be correct in some way, or none of them may be, or, how was I really to parse out all of these claims? Christianity was perhaps the one that I was least interested to pursue and to learn about. And that was because that was probably the only faith tradition I'd had any kind of exposure to in a negative way. Really, all that I had interfaced with Christianity about was that it was the religion of the colonial oppressor in India. and also that it was often, there's a lot of missionary work that I knew about, or that my father would tell me about, people tricking other people, or misusing and abusing other people for the sake of being able to say that they won converts. Not at all, by the way, saying that all missionaries are this way. Please don't misunderstand me. It's just these are the stories I heard, and these kinds of things did happen. Um, so I was, if anything, I had a sort of animosity toward Christianity, but I felt that I was being intellectually dishonest. If I was really going to do a comparative religion, how could I discount one of the largest religions in the world? So I did ultimately end up folding that into my study, um, and I was blown away in a way that I never could have imagined. Again, at first it was merely academic, but as I was reading the story, here you had this hero of the story who is naked and disfigured. And frankly, at the time, I felt kind of pathetic. Um, I had been reading stories of Krishna, right? Who, when his divinity was challenged, he'd become 60 feet tall and, whip a chakra at you. I kind of identified with that. Or even the sort of valiant prophet warrior Muhammad. Like there was a sense in which I resonated, right? Um, and made me think about how stories of demigods and superheroes in the Roman tradition, in the Greek tradition, in the Norse tradition, in the Indian tradition, and on and on. Those are all things, I think there's a reason why we resonate with them, right? A lot of those demigods and gods, they're kind of, they've got these superpowers that we wish we had. And it makes a lot of sense to me why we would make up those stories. But they all end up relating to each other with the same kinds of sins that we do, right? Um, but I can imagine coming up with those stories, and there's a sense in which we resonate with them. But here was the first time I was encountering a story where I thought, what is this? I mean, it was a stumbling block for me, um, just as scripture says it would be. But it was the kind of stumbling block that just kept making me want to come back. I mean, I'd put it down for a couple of days and say, I don't really know what's going on here. But then I'd come back to it. And I think it was just how distinct it was in its presentation of the supposed hero. But of course, I would learn, right? And this was really an important watershed moment for me, is that apparently Jesus wasn't on the cross because he was powerless, right? And it wasn't pathetic. In fact, he was actually on the cross because that's how far he would go solely for the sake of others with no self interest at all. That completely disabused me of my notions of power. It challenged me in a way that I'd never been challenged before. It didn't make me a Christian, it didn't convince me of the historicity of Christ in that moment, but it made me draw into the Bible in a way, in a more personal, more inquisitive way than I had felt with any other faith tradition, right? And I think the moment you give some room for the Holy Spirit, I mean, he just runs with it from there, right? Um, and it was challenging when I did eventually become Christian, um, uh, because I was not compelled by the moral laws of Christianity any more than I was from other faith traditions, right? But it was meeting the person of Christ, right? Here you had someone who was completely turning upside down. It was just very countercultural for then and for now, right? And that timelessness was incredibly awakening for me. But it was challenging too, because when I became a Christian, there are so few Brahmin Hindu converts. There may be quite a number of Hindu converts, but Brahmin Hindu in particular is extraordinarily rare. Um, Brahmins are considered kind of the keepers of the faith, if you will, and the ones who have sort of been responsible for passing down the Hindu faith over the generations. And it's one of the longest standing, faith traditions in the world. So I didn't have a lot of company or community, people to talk to say, hey, what was your experience in like going from Brahmanism to Christianity? Instead, I got a whole lot of uh, um, confusion and hurt and pain from my family members trying to understand why I was doing this. Was I rejecting my Indian heritage? Was I rejecting my brownness? Was I trying to become white and Western or something? What was going on here, right? And all of these questions were not unfounded. They even worried and wondered whether I'd be changing my name, right? Um, but the process, the challenge really of explaining Christianity to my family actually helped deepen my own faith, right? Because right from the get go, I was forced to think deeply about what were just cultural window dressing and what was really the heart of the faith, right? So that, I mean, that's what I have to share about my testimony. I hope that that is encouraging to you. If it's okay, I'd actually like to transition now for about 5-10 minutes to share some reflections on DEI. Dr. Martinez, would that be okay at this point? Great,
Yes, that would be wonderful.
great. My first reflection is when we talk about D and then we talk about I, diversity and inclusion, what I have found is we talk a heck of a lot more about the D than we do the I. Right? A lot of the focus on campus, anyway, is on recruitment, making sure that our student body is diverse, making sure that our faculty body in our departments is diverse. And I don't mean to set aside the importance of this. Absolutely, that is a part of the equation of promoting an equitable environment. But what is, I think, harder is I, and that's inclusion, right? It's one thing to say, hey, we've got a diverse body, but do all the people and the backgrounds that they represent in that body feel included? Do they feel like their voices are heard? Or do they still feel like they're there as token members of the community so that we can check the diversity box, right? And I think that's a really important distinction. Um, and if we don't really address the I in a meaningful way, then we end up just treating this like it ends up just becoming performative, whatever changes we do put in place, even if we do become more diverse. So I think wrestling with the I, even though it's messier and harder, is a really important thing to do as a community. Um, One of the things I have done with the Center for Genomics at Cornell that I serve as the director for is to make a series of commitments. And if you actually go to Center for Vertebrate Genomics at Cornell, there's a diversity link there, and you can click on it and see all of the commitments that we make as a center for promoting inclusion and not just diversity. And one of the most important things we have come across in communication with members of diverse communities at Cornell is seeing uh, people that look like them on the panels that we host, on the invited speakers that we bring to campus, in the review committees of the grant applications that we run. Um, all of those ways, in the leadership of CVG, in the trainee leadership of CVG, the center I direct, in all of those ways, making sure that there is good gender representation, representation across different ancestral background spectrum, representation across different people coming from historically under-resourced environments versus better resourced environments. There's so many dimensions of diversity, right? And to be sure that we are thinking across as many of those as possible and having representatives from those communities in positions of leadership, not just in the membership of the center, right? I think that's been really important in helping the members of the center feel like, I'm represented. People that look like me or come from my background are part of the leadership. And they have a voice in shaping what the center does and the decisions that the center is making going forward. That's not the final answer, but I think that's the starting point for working toward genuine inclusion and building a culture where we're actively listening to everybody and not just saying, yay, they're there, and we're checking the diversity box. The second reflection is I've come across this idea more than once that promoting DEI is basically being vocal and talking about and addressing discrimination, inequity, and systemic bias. Okay. And I want to challenge the idea that those are equal. Challenging discrimination, talking about it, promoting equitable processes is a really important part of promoting DEI, but it is not the whole story. Okay. And part of the reason why it's not the whole story is when we keep talking about how discrimination has kept people down, how systemic bias has made it a lot harder for some people groups over others, we're speaking the truth. However, it's only half truth. The other half of the truth is, despite the bias, despite the discrimination, there are, for example, Black scholars and leaders and inventors and pioneers whose names have been lost to history, right? They've actually been there. It's not that because these populations have been discriminated against, no one has been able to emerge as scholars and leaders. No, no. Despite the discrimination, many people have emerged as scholars and leaders and movers and shakers and pioneers. And it's important to lift that up. It's important to actually bring those names back into our consciousness so we're not just thinking that it's just a victim mentality, but it is actually, hey, despite the inequity and the discrimination, look at the grit and the perseverance and the strength of these individuals who rose to lead our societies. To make that point really clear, one of the things that I've done in my lab is discussions called TRUE, TRUE, Truthful Recognition of Unsung Excellence is what that stands for. Okay. And every other lab meeting, so one lab meeting will be sort of a traditional, we'll talk about the science that's going on in the lab. But the next lab meeting will be true presentations from people in our lab. Everybody will sign up. In one semester, we focused on Black pioneers. Another semester, we focused on Hispanic, Latino pioneers. And, we've gone with different people groups that people in the lab have been interested in learning more about. We'll do research as a team to identify people who have actually made remarkable contributions in the scientific and biomedical space in the past and present. And then people will be designated the names of these individuals to do research on them and to present about them. And the whole idea here is to bring their names at the forefront of our minds. The vast majority of these people, despite the fact that they've done amazing things, are not known to us, right? As I said, they've been lost to history, and that's a shame. And that part of it needs to be remedied and brought into the fore, just as much as the conversations about past and present discriminatory and biased processes. The final reflection for me is I have found, as I'm sure many of you have as well, that didactic instruction, so classroom teaching, is very, very Eurocentric. And this is true in elementary school and middle school and high school, but also true in college, unfortunately, right? Even at a place like Cornell, where we you revel in the fact that the world comes to us and we have all these countries represented at Cornell, and yet still the teaching appears to me very Eurocentric. And what I mean by that, in part at least, is that the examples that we give, and I'm guilty of this, so I'm not pointing fingers as much as I am trying to be introspective here. The examples we often give when we talk about such and such person invented this, or so and so found this, or named this anatomical structure, or as we give examples like that, they're overwhelmingly European or individuals of European ancestry. Nothing wrong with the Europeans, but I think we need to get more balance in the presentation. It is certainly not the case that only Europeans and individuals of European ancestry have made contributions in the scientific space. And so being more intentional and thoughtful about the examples that we give of individuals who have made discoveries. I personally have had experience where just this past semester, mentioning a black scientist who made a discovery relating to cortisol in one of the classes that I teach in physiology, rather than a white male who I've used in the past who made some similar contributions, was eye opening for several black students in my class who said, I had no idea that black people have done this kind of stuff before. Right? Um, and this is, and I would argue that this is important not just for the black students in the course, obviously, but for all of us to have a more balanced and honest understanding of the diverse people groups that have contributed to science, and the shoulders that we stand on are European, but also everywhere else from the world too. And I think the more we incorporate that truth and that idea into our didactic experiences, the more our culture will just start to change. I mean, the narratives will be different. At the end of the day, we follow stories. And I think one of the things we ought to be engaged as far as a long game with DEI is concerned, is changing the narrative, right, to something that is more true, something that is more real, something that is more representative of what has really happened in history. I hope there was something of interest there to glean. Now I'll leave it there and see if there are any thoughts or questions or ideas.
So I'll just jump in, and this is a wonderful time to place your questions into the chat. And Dr. Sethupathy, could you also give us your reflections on DEI in your sciences? You spoke yesterday about DNA and the wonders of the Lord's creation. Could you elaborate on that as well?
Yeah, there are two things at least that I'm thinking about there, Dr. Martinez. One is in how we conduct genetics and genomics research. Um, there's a long, tortured, and sometimes even sordid history of how genetic information of, let's say, indigenous people groups or other underrepresented minority communities and historically excluded communities, how their samples, their DNA have been used for studies without proper consent, without proper respect for their traditions and how they might hold their land or their samples or whatnot to be sacred, without a proper building of relationship to respect those people groups, their desires, their wishes, and to use the research that is done for the benefit of that community. Right, a lot of that has been missing in the past. I see a wonderful trend in the right direction, and where I think we're on the right trajectory. But there needs to be a lot of discussion about how we conduct genetic research, especially as it pertains to underrepresented minorities in our country and beyond. So that's one thing. I will mention there are really, really exciting companies that are starting to dot the landscape. One is called Variant Bio, if you're interested just in an example. It's based out of Seattle. They are conducting genetics research, but a substantive fraction, I believe, of their profits goes back into those communities to actually help with the progress in their communities. And also, the projects are developed in collaboration with the communities as opposed to swooping in and saying, hey, here's what we're doing and trying to get them involved. So it's a true collaborative effort with marginalized communities that I think is a brilliant model, and I hope to see more companies and institutions take this kind of approach. So that's one. The second is, I think genetics and genomics has been a great equalizer. in our conversations of race. And the reason why I say that is because, um, like very few other areas of research and study, genomics has helped make it clear that the boundaries that we place on different races based on observed traits like skin color and hair type and eye shape and things like that are extraordinarily bad proxies for people groups, right? That if you actually look at the genetics and look at the full DNA sequences of individuals around the world, right, it is quite likely if you were to select at random someone from Western Africa, select someone with ancestry from Eastern Africa, and select someone with ancestry from Northern Europe, that you could actually have one of those Africans, most likely the Eastern African, more similar to the Northern European than the Western African when it comes to their DNA and when it comes to their genome. And these kinds of studies have now been done over the course of the last 10, 15 years over and over and over again to demonstrate that the social constructs that have evolved out of our, looking at discernible traits like skin color turn out to be really, really bad ways of grouping people by your perceived similarity. Genetically speaking, it's just not the case, right? And so I think that's what I mean by it's been an equalizer, because you realize just how poor these proxies are, right? And that should really challenge your notion of racial groupings. Um, I'm careful to not say that race is not a thing, because it has become a thing, unfortunately, right? Because those social constructs have been imprinted into our cultures. I think it's unfair to people who have been marginalized to act as though it's just not a real thing anymore, so let's just not talk about it. The reality is, unfortunately, we do have to talk about it because it has been abused. The concept has been used to abuse people. Um, but if you just really think about it biologically, it's not real, right? There is something to be said for, okay, people in very close geographic proximity are likely to be a little bit more related genetically than people who are more distant. Yes, as a rule, generally, you can see that trend, okay? Um, but in no way, shape, or form does that track with skin color, for example, right? Or with hair type or something like that. And the reason for this is actually really straightforward. The amount of genetic material in your genome that accounts for things like skin color and eye shape or hair type are infinitesimally small. I mean, there's just a very, very, very small fraction of your genome that contributes to those traits and features. It's just that those happen to be easily discernible. And so we have erroneously grouped people into biological groups based on those observable traits. And that's profoundly unfortunate.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm checking the chat right now. I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. Aaron, let's see. Oh, great. Okay, so Aaron, thank you. The similarity of different races was brought up by last year's Chris speaker, Dr. Terrence Keel. Are these two the same question, guys? In the use of Eurocentric examples, do you feel those should be reduced, or should POC examples be increased? Is it an either or situation, or a both and need? Wow.
I'm not sure I fully got it, Dr. Martinez. Do you mind repeating for me? I'm sorry.
Well, I'm getting another message saying that it was a comment. So now I'm not.
Okay.
Now I'm not. Here, okay. In the use of Eurocentric examples, do you feel those should be reduced, or should POC examples be increased? Is it an either or situation or both and need? And I'm sorry for my misreading of the first time.
Oh, yeah, no problem at all. No problem at all. No, that's a great question. And again, I want to emphasize, I think the goal here is not to diminish the contributions of many people of European ancestry. That is not the goal whatsoever. Some of my favorite scientists, I mentioned one in the talk last night, Johannes Kepler, is of European ancestry, right? There are wonderful and beautiful examples. But I think that the more critical thing is that we be intentional about learning, because I think a lot of us just don't even know, me included.
Mm.
So we should first just learn about the contributions made by individuals from, POC individuals and across the world at different points in time, and challenge ourselves to include more of those in our curriculum.
Mm.
I think because of time constraints, that may mean that we include a few less individuals of European ancestry. But in no way am I suggesting that we should disregard the contributions of people of European ancestry and only focus on POC. That wouldn't be truthful either, right? I think we just need to strive for a balance.
Okay, great. Thank you. So doctor, and I'm still monitoring the chat while I'm talking to you right now. Yesterday, I have a bit of some examples that are still floating around from your talk. And as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, can you make the connection to your points yesterday? Because you were bringing up in your field the need for curiosity, the need for building upon humanity, and the need for joy in the work we do. Well, how does all that relate to then our diversity, equity, and then, as you said, focusing on inclusion? How does that connect?
I think one of the ways that it connects is people from different backgrounds and traditions sometimes have unique ways of experiencing and expressing the joy that they feel in the work that they do, right? Diversifying or learning more about the way in which human beings experience and express the joy that they feel adds to our experience. I really believe that, you know. So, for example, even as it pertains to the expression of my Christian faith, I find it really enriching to not worship God only the way that we do in American churches, right? It's really, really neat to go to countries in the East and worship with Christians there. Their style can be very different, right? Because some of the local traditions are incorporated, right? Taking your shoe off before you actually go into church, right? It's an expression of respect to not have dirt on their sandals and shoes as they come before the Lord. It may not be like needed, but it's a carryover from their tradition, and it challenges me, and it makes me think, oh, you don't need to take your shoes off necessarily, but that's their way of trying to get into a humble posture. That's their way of, how am I doing that? It can challenge me, right? By learning more about the way in which they express themselves before God, even if their way isn't necessarily better than my way, right? And so, much in the same way as we learn from one another about how we experience science and what it teaches us and what it's showing us, we might have different ways of feeling about that or expressing the joy that we get out of that. And I think the more of that we have in each of our lives, the better for us. It's just more enriching.
Beautiful. I have another question popping up. When communicating with other Brahmin Hindus regarding faith, and what type of terminology have you found to be most effective to help connect a biblical Christology with them rather than historical institutionalized Christianity?
Yeah, terminology. That's a good and interesting question. I'd have to think about that for a minute. But the first thing that actually comes to mind is acknowledging. I'll mention this in the chapel message tomorrow for whoever may listen to that. But I think being very open, honest, and vulnerable about the mistakes of the Christian church, and how or how not that may be reflective of Christ himself, I think that has got to be an important part of the conversation. Just kind of glossing or papering over that is not going to work, right? Because a lot of as Gandhi himself said, right, he may have considered Christianity further had it not been for Christians, and that's deeply saddening to me, right? So I think being really honest and forthright about the mistakes of the church, as it pertains to the way specifically they've interfaced with other faith traditions, I think that's really important. Secondly, it's my personal view that other faith traditions are not evil or of the devil. Right? They may not be right, they may not be fully encompassing truth, but I actually think there are elements of truth in all major faith traditions. Um, I don't say that to be relativistic. I am a Christian and Jesus is the way and the truth and the life. But I say that because there are more touch points across these religious traditions than we give credit.
Mm.
And sort of dogmatic and fundamentalist views of, and I hope I'm not offending anybody here, but I think those approaches can be really off putting, because it can make people feel as though Christians leave no room for seeing value in any other tradition.
Mm.
And I just don't think that's true. It's just not my lived experience, right?
Mm.
One of the most powerful examples of what it looks like to be a king of the Christian order, a king of the type that Jesus would, I think, want and that he exemplified himself, is actually from a story in Hindu tradition. Now, I don't think it's a story that happened or that it has historical basis, but it's a story of this king called Rantideva, Rantideva. That's the closest I've come to literature to the kind to what a king should actually be.
Mm.
And it's not as though he's Christian; he's in the Hindu thing. But I often think of that. Christ often leads me to think of Rantideva when I think of what it looks like to be a good leader, right? So I think fruit and wonderful examples can be found in lots of places that you may not even expect. Finding those touch points and connecting with people on those things, but of course being uncompromising about who Christ is and the centrality of Him. I think that's the best way. If someone were to try to talk to me, I think that would be the starting point, is to approach it that way.
Great. And doctor, I know we're running out of time, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question. Um, as you are well aware, there's a schism between Christianity and science, or the social media and the sciences, or maybe even a most recent distrust
Yeah.
of scientific theory, or even just representation of some of the sciences. How might we begin to build bridges again to that reality of truth, as you mentioned earlier?
I think a lot of the perceived conflict between science and faith, although there are some real issues to work through there, are actually not so much a science and faith conflict as much as it is persons of faith and persons of science conflict. Um,
Hmm.
and what I mean by that is you a lot of evangelical Christians, for example, with whom I have spoken around the country, who are, let's say, vaccine resistant or vaccine hesitant, or um, the tension has not been with science itself. In
Hmm.
fact, they appear to be embedded in communities that say that they have better science or different science or whatever, but it's not so much that they're throwing science away. It's that they're saying, I don't want to listen to those scientists
Mm,
who are telling me about their science, right? So
mm,
it's a lack of trust with a group of people as opposed to saying, I don't believe truth can be found in science,
Mm,
right? So it's a breakdown of trust more than anything else.
okay.
And I think that that breakdown has the origins of that or the contributions to that are from both sides. I really believe that a culture of condescension and scientists just working in their ivory towers and not reaching out to communities and being a part of communities in a meaningful way has, I think, profoundly contributed to this feeling that they're not one of us and they've got their own agenda, and they're over there thinking that they're better and smarter than us. And I think that has contributed to this feeling of, why would I listen to you, right? Or even broader issues like, you're a part of the establishment, or you're a part of the government, or I just don't trust you. I don't trust you, right? So
Mm,
even if I have a scientific question, I'm going to turn to my pastor and my mother, my father, my community members, because listen, they're the ones that have been there for me. They're the ones who I feel as though I can trust. Never mind, of course, that they may not have the requisite information for the question at hand, but still you're going to go to the people you trust. So I think it boils down to a generations long game of building trust. And I don't see how you do that unless we are able to actually see one another for who you are and actually be a part of one another's communities. I'll just leave you with one thing. The AAAS, the largest scientific organization in the country, has a program called DOZER. It's the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. And they ran an event, or had an initiative a couple of years ago, where they brought leaders in faith communities, synagogues, and churches in the Atlanta area together with scientists in the Atlanta area at Emory and Georgia Tech. And they had a whole day of programming, or a couple of days of programming, where the scientists went into the halls of faith, and the faith leaders went into the science labs, learned a lot from each other. And these were all people all that were skeptical of the other group and the agendas that they had to marginalize one another. They walked away, and the number one exit interview comment from both sides: oh, they're just people.
mm,
I mean, the fact that the other side, that they're just people, is a revelation to you. I think that tells us just how wide the chasm is, and how much we have sort of imbibed the caricatures of these groups as opposed to who they really are and the complexities present
right.
therein, right? So I don't know how we do that, Dr. Martinez. It's a passion and a dream of mine to somehow find a way for more scientists to be embedded in communities with more people of faith. And I don't mean to be Pollyanna. I don't say that if we do that, we're all just going to, like, hold hands and sing kumbaya.
Yeah,
But I think that's the start. We can't build trust with each other if we're not a part of each other's lives. And I think it has to start there.
there you go. We have one last question. I think we have maybe a couple minutes here, Doctor. I'm going to, Dr. Keen, I'm going to go, I think he answered part of the first part of your question, but I'm going to start it with, is there a way that our terminology can be altered to introduce a common unity as humanity, supported through scientific and Christian faith worldviews? Can we move forward to unity while still progressing with equality and equity? So, and you've been framing your work today and yesterday around possibilities and being open to others. So, what are some of your thoughts? And maybe take this as a closing question.
So, am I right to understand the question as, um, are there is there terminology that we can use, even from a scientific standpoint, that might be more accurate, truthful, and equitable than than things like race. Is that the idea, or am I missing the question?
No, I think that is the question. In the book that I cited, there was the question of this whole concept of race coming out of really a very biased pseudoscience
Mm.
that led to the
Yeah.
kind of the support for a lot of the atrocities we've seen, and those things have carried on. And so the question is should we abandon some of that jargon and that terminology, which automatically goes to physical characteristics as defining a group, versus getting something that could redefine and better establish our unity based on what we know and understand now.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. And Christopher or Chris, you're killing me with the Chiefs in the background there.
Sorry, I apologized in the chat. I'm sorry. That was a great game, and you guys, kudos to you. It was great.
amazing. It was amazing. I had a couple thoughts about that, Chris, and I think one is from a purely scientific standpoint. One of the things we are trying to do is to get away from using words like race because they don't really have a biological or genetic basis, and instead use words that we feel are more accurate and more inclusive, and that's just saying things like ancestral background, right? Everybody's got one of those, right? And so, and yet there's a recognition in using those terms that those ancestral backgrounds are going to crisscross as we look at, everybody's genealogies. So I think that kind of terminology is more conducive to helping to see that we're all a part of one human race, as opposed to these distinct groups that don't don't have any touch points. I think one of the real benefits of things like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, they've had their issues and challenges associated with them. Even as a scientist, I have some concerns about the presentation of the information. But one of the really nice things has been helping people to see that their ancestries may be a lot more diverse than they had presumed or the narratives in their families had told, right? So I actually think the kinds of the programs and the initiatives that have enrolled more people into finding out about their ancestries, that can only be helpful in my opinion, right? And increasingly the lines are blurred, right? Like, what does it mean to say that you're German when I don't know, like, is 30% good enough? Is 50% good enough? I think the more that we talk in terms of the probabilities, the mixtures, the more maybe we begin to just appreciate this notion that it's not as distinct as we may think it is. Right? And that's one of the hardest things, Chris, is that it's really hard for people to understand the mixture concept, right? Like it is hard to understand probability distributions. People want to know, if I get the vaccine, am I going to get COVID or not? And it doesn't work that way, right? It's a probability distribution. So I think those are some of the hardest things to do. But the more that we incorporate that into our language and our communications with one another, the more it'll become a part of our stories.
Well, beautifully put. And thank you, Dr. Sethupathy, for your time today. Thank you for your inspirational thoughts. Thank you for spending time with a wonderful cross-section of our diversity ambassadors. And we wish we had more time with you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I hope at least some of what I shared was thought-provoking. And I look forward to hearing in the future about your own experiences. I'm hoping that I can make it back to APU in person at some point. And if there's ever an opportunity to meet you in person, I would really look forward to it.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. And Dr. Sethupathy is going to be presenting tomorrow in chapel as well. So if any of you are going to go to chapel tomorrow, you'll get another beautiful presentation. So thank you so much. And we look forward to a continued conversation with you in the future.
Thanks so much, everybody.